A blind German shepherd waited in the rain, standing guard beside a fragile little girl. People passed without a glance, until one weary man stopped. In that moment, a broken past and a fragile present collided, and everything changed forever. Before we begin, if stories of hope and second chances touch your heart, share where you're watching from. It's always a blessing to see how far faith and love can travel. Enjoy the story. Seattle had a way of swallowing color when the rain fell, leaving the world painted in shades of silver, slate, and muted glass. That evening, the sky pressed low, clouds sagging against the tops of the skyscrapers like a tired hand leaning on a desk. Water poured in narrow streams down the neon signs of Pike Street and slid across the sidewalks in mirrors that no one dared admire. The storm was steady, not furious but relentless, a rhythm of drops that dulled the usual noise of the city into a muffled hum. Under this gray canopy walked David Miller, a man whose name was stitched into half the city's business journals, but whose presence often passed unnoticed in public spaces. At 42, David cut the figure of a man who had built walls around himself and forgotten how to climb them. His hair, once a deep walnut brown, had begun to surrender threads of silver at the temples. Combed carefully to one side, with a precision that spoke of discipline rather than vanity. His face was clean-shaven, angular, with a line etched permanently between his brows, the inheritance of years negotiating contracts, calculating risks, and staring down spreadsheets long after midnight. He wore a long gray trench coat tailored to his lean but tall frame, shoulders squared, the belt neatly knotted, the kind of garment chosen not for warmth, but for image. Beneath it, a navy suit whispered of his status, but his tie hung slightly loosened, as though the rain had granted him permission to relax a fraction. He was a man whose life moved between glass towers, chauffeured cars, and boardrooms heavy with voices. But tonight he was simply a man with a canceled meeting, standing on the wet pavement because he didn't know where else to be. Loneliness clung to him like the mist, unseen by strangers, yet persistent in his bones. He paused at a weathered bus stop, a small wooden bench beneath a plastic canopy, whose edges were lined with rivulets of rain. Normally, David would have retreated to the warmth of his office or a private car waiting nearby, but something about the emptiness in his schedule had driven him to linger here. He told himself he was simply waiting out the rain, though he knew well he was waiting for nothing in particular, maybe even for a reminder that he still belonged to the world beyond his empire of numbers. It was here, amidst the blur of headlights reflecting off slick asphalt, that he noticed the girl. She appeared through the curtain of rain like a misplaced figure in a watercolor painting, her small body shivering beneath a pale yellow raincoat far too thin for the chill. The hood sagged against her head, weighted with water, strands of hair the color of wheat clinging damply to her cheeks. She could not have been more than 8 years old, her arms wrapped tightly around a paper bag pressed to her chest, as though it were a treasure chest she dared not drop. Her sneakers, once white, had dulled to gray, the fabric fraying at the seams, the soles, slapping the pavement with every uncertain step. Behind her moved a dog, and not just any dog, but a German shepherd with a frame still broad and noble, though softened by age. His coat carried the faded saddle pattern of his breed, black mixed with tan, though streaks of silver had begun to weave along his back. Around his eyes was tied a white cloth, knotted carefully at the back of his head, covering the clouded orbs beneath. This was Shadow, a creature both vulnerable and fierce, his blindness transforming him into a being who navigated not by sight, but by sound, scent, and something deeper, a faith in loyalty. He was 10 years old, perhaps older, his ears pricked high, his gait cautious yet steady. A dog who had once lived to protect and had never forgotten how, even when darkness claimed his vision. Emily, though David did not yet know her name, staggered toward the bench. The bag in her arms sagged under the rain, and when she tried to sit, her knees gave way. She crumpled silently to the wet ground, the bag spilling open to reveal 2 wrapped slices of bread, a dented can of soup, and a bruised apple rolling into a puddle. The sight cut through David with a sharpness he had not felt in years. His coffee cup fell from his hand as he rushed forward, his knees striking the pavement without care for the water that soaked through his expensive trousers. He lifted the girl gently, her body frighteningly light, her skin cold against his palm. her face tilted upward, eyes wide and dark, lashes heavy with rain. Her lips parted and a whisper escaped, fragile as fog. "I have to bring dinner home. Mommy's sick." Something splintered in David. The words pulled him back through decades, to nights when his own mother coughed blood into a handkerchief while he pretended not to notice, to years when his father's absence was more permanent than any death could be, to the memory of clutching his own meager groceries with the desperate wish that they would be enough. The wound was old, but it had never healed, and now, looking at this child, it throbbed open. As if sensing her fragility, Shadow planted himself firmly between David and the rest of the world, his stance protective, though unthreatening. He didn't growl. Instead, he simply stood, head lowered, ears twitching to every sound, the drip of water from the canopy, the cough of the girl, the uneven breath that seemed to echo in his chest as if he shared it. The rain plastered his fur, the white cloth over his eyes darkened with damp. But he didn't move. His loyalty was an anchor. David met the dog's sightless face, and, for a fleeting second, felt judged not by what he owned, but by what he might choose to do next. "I've got you," David murmured, though he wasn't sure if he meant it for the girl, the dog, or the child he had once been. Without hesitation, he lifted Emily into his arms. Her small hand clung instinctively to the collar of his trench coat, fingers trembling but sure, as if recognizing in him a momentary harbor. The paper bag lay abandoned on the bench, soggy and collapsed, but David picked it up too, tucking it under his arm. Shadow gave a soft huff, a sound not of warning, but of acknowledgement, and fell into step beside them, every movement precise as though following a map written in scent and memory. The hospital was only 3 blocks away, though in the rain it felt like miles. The automatic doors slid open, releasing a gust of warm, antiseptic air. The fluorescent lights inside seemed harsh after the muted gray of the storm, but for the first time that evening, David felt something akin to relief. A nurse at the triage desk looked up quickly. She was in her early 30s, with auburn hair pulled back into a tired bun and freckles dotting her pale skin. Her name tag read Megan O'Leary. She had the look of someone who had learned to juggle exhaustion with efficiency, her voice brisk yet softened by compassion. "What happened?" she asked, already motioning for a gurney. "She collapsed," David replied, his voice unsteady. "She needs help." Emily's lips moved again as she whispered her name. "Emily Carter," before her head lolled against his shoulder. Megan worked quickly, attaching monitors, wrapping a blanket around the child. She didn't question David's identity, only nodded as if recognizing that explanations could wait. Meanwhile, Shadow remained outside the threshold of the sliding door. The security guard on duty, a broad man with thinning hair, eyed the dog warily. Yet, Shadow made no attempt to push forward. Instead, he sat at the exact edge of the line, nose pointed toward the curtained bay where Emily had been wheeled, ears twitching at every faint sound. The dog exhaled slowly, almost rhythmically, and the resident physician, a young woman named Doctor, Alana Coleman with dark braids tucked under a patterned cap, paused mid-step. She studied Shadow for a long moment before whispering, "He's listening to her breathing." David glanced at the dog, then back to Emily as the gurney disappeared behind the curtain. His heart clenched in a way it hadn't since he was a boy. Something had cracked open in him, something he could neither stop nor explain. For now, all he could do was stay. And Shadow stayed too, blind eyes covered, ears tuned to the fragile rhythm of a little girl's breath. The fluorescent glow of the emergency wing hummed with its own rhythm, a relentless buzz that pressed against David Miller's temples as he sat in the molded plastic chair beside the narrow hospital bed. Hours had passed since the stormy rescue at the bus stop, but the imprint of the rain and the weight of Emily Carter's small frame in his arms lingered, as if carved into his very muscles. The girl lay beneath a pale blanket, her hair still damp, fanning across the pillow like strands of spun gold dulled by hardship. Her face, delicate and framed by lashes too long for someone who carried such weight, remained slack in sleep. Yet even in her stillness, there was a stubborn composure etched into the tilt of her chin, a quiet strength that spoke of a childhood forced to mature far too quickly. Emily stirred, her eyelids fluttering as though battling the heaviness that clung to her. Slowly, her dark eyes opened, glazed at first, then sharpening with urgency. She tried to sit up, clutching the blanket with hands that trembled from fatigue. Her voice was soft but insistent, as fragile as tissue, yet steeled with determination. "I need to go home. Mommy, she doesn't know where I am. She gets worse when she's scared." David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, the trench coat still damp from the storm draped over the back of the chair. His tie was gone, abandoned earlier on a waiting room table, and his hair had fallen loose from its usual precision. In the harsh light of the hospital room, the lines of exhaustion across his face seemed deeper. The guarded edges of his demeanor softened. He spoke gently, though his voice carried the gravity of a man used to being obeyed. "You fainted on the street, Emily. You need rest. If you walk out now, you could collapse again." Emily shook her head, stubbornness burning in her gaze despite the weakness of her body. "I haven't eaten since yesterday morning," she admitted, her voice tight. "But that doesn't matter. My mom needs me more." The confession struck David like a blow. Not eaten since yesterday morning. The words unlatched something inside him, a floodgate releasing the memory of his own childhood, when hunger was a companion he had learned to name but never tame. At that moment, Nurse Megan O'Leary entered, her auburn hair now escaping from its bun in stray curls. She carried a clipboard against her chest, her expression brisk but her movements careful, the mark of a woman who had trained herself to blend efficiency with kindness. "Vitals are stable," she said, offering David a brief nod before turning to Emily. "You're dehydrated, sweetheart, and your blood sugar is low. We'll get you some fluids and something light to eat." Emily frowned but didn't argue. Her body betrayed her with a shiver she couldn't suppress, and Megan adjusted the blanket with a small, motherly tug. Outside the glass wall, Shadow remained stationed like a sentinel. The blind German shepherd sat with his body pressed close to the sliding door, ears flicking with every passing sound. The white cloth tied neatly around his eyes had darkened with dried rain, but it gave him a strange dignity, as if he bore not blindness, but a mark of quiet honor. People passed him with curiosity and wariness, but Shadow neither begged nor barked. He simply waited, nose occasionally lifting to scent the sterile air, every muscle taut with silent vigilance. It was then that a new figure appeared, a boy no older than 10, wheeled down the corridor by his mother. The boy, thin and pale, with hair the color of honey and an IV pole clipped to his chair, craned his neck when he spotted the dog. His name was Ethan Reynolds, a patient on the pediatric floor, known for his restless curiosity and the ability to charm even the sternest nurses with his mischievous grin. Ethan's mother, a weary woman with crow's feet etched deeper by worry, whispered for him not to disturb the dog, but Ethan ignored her. With a conspiratorial glance at Shadow, he stretched out his thin hand and whistled softly. Shadow's ears perked immediately. Blind though he was, he tilted his head toward Ethan, tail twitching once in acknowledgement. Slowly, cautiously, the dog moved closer until his nose brushed the boy's palm. Ethan giggled, the sound bright in the otherwise sterile corridor. "He can't see me, Mom," Ethan whispered, "but he knows I'm here. He hears me breathing." His mother smiled faintly, tugging the blanket tighter around her son's shoulders. "Careful," she murmured, though her eyes softened at the sight. David, stepping briefly into the hall to stretch his legs, paused at the sight of the boy with Shadow. Something about the ease of the connection, the way the blind dog responded not to sight, but to sound and presence, made David's chest tighten. Shadow wasn't merely waiting. He was guarding, mapping the world through invisible threads, tethered to Emily's fragile breath inside the room. David's eyes lingered on the dog longer than he intended. For years he had measured loyalty in contracts and signatures. Now he was confronted with a creature who had nothing to gain, yet refused to leave. Back in the room, Emily watched David through narrowed eyes. Though pale and thin, her posture had straightened, her suspicion growing. "Why are you here?" she asked bluntly. "You don't know me. People don't usually stop." Her words were not bitter, but laced with the blunt honesty of a child who had seen too much disappointment to sugarcoat reality. David opened his mouth, closed it, then sighed. He wasn't sure how to answer. Why was he here? Because he couldn't walk past? Because she reminded him of himself? Because the crack in his chest had widened the moment he heard her whisper about her sick mother? He didn't know how to explain any of that. So instead, he settled on the truth in its simplest form. Because you collapsed, and I couldn't ignore you. Emily studied him for a moment, then pulled the blanket closer around her. She said nothing, but her silence carried the faintest shift, a pause where suspicion and tentative trust wrestled quietly. As evening fell, the storm outside subsided into a mist that clung to the hospital windows. The city lights flickered beyond, blurred halos in the wet glass. David's phone buzzed incessantly with reminders from his assistant, Natalie. A quarterly review, a rescheduled board call, a late-night conference with investors in Tokyo. Normally, the pings of his calendar were the lifeblood of his existence, dictating every hour with precision. Tonight, he silenced them all. For the first time in years, he abandoned the carefully curated architecture of his obligations and simply sat beside a girl he didn't know, in a sterile room that smelled of antiseptic and faint hope, waiting for answers he couldn't yet articulate. In the hall, Ethan was wheeled back to his room, but not before leaning down once more to pat Shadow's head. "You're like a superhero," the boy whispered, "a shadow that sees without eyes." Shadow huffed softly in response, then returned to his vigil by the door. The nickname lingered in David's mind, a shadow that sees without eyes. Inside, Emily's breathing steadied as she drifted back to sleep. David watched her small chest rise and fall beneath the blanket, her face finally relaxed in slumber. He leaned back in his chair, loosening his stiff shoulders, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself to feel it fully. The fracture of loneliness giving way, if only slightly, to something unfamiliar but undeniable: connection. And so, the night settled, with David abandoning his schedule, Emily dreaming restless dreams of home, and Shadow stationed outside, the blind sentinel who measured the world not with vision, but with faith. Seattle's rain had eased into a mist by the following afternoon, the kind that clung to collars and coated the air with a metallic chill. The city streets glistened beneath a dim winter light, reflections stretching like broken glass across the asphalt. David Miller followed Emily Carter's small frame as she led him through narrow alleys lined with sagging fire escapes and shops long abandoned. Her shoes slapped against the pavement, too thin to keep out the damp, but her steps carried the certainty of a child who had made this journey countless times before. Shadow padded behind them, his pace steady, ears twitching at every passing noise. Though blind, the German shepherd navigated with remarkable precision, his white cloth bandana fluttering slightly whenever the wind caught it. David's polished shoes were splattered with mud, his trench coat creased from the previous night's vigil. He had no business being here. His world was boardrooms and towers of glass. But the image of Emily collapsing on the wet pavement refused to loosen its hold on him, and so he followed, each step tugged forward by an invisible tether woven from guilt, memory, and something dangerously close to compassion. The neighborhood grew quieter as they turned down a narrow street, where the buildings leaned inward as though conspiring in secrecy. Paint peeled from door frames, windows wore grime like cataracts, and the smell of mildew seeped from every crack. Emily stopped at a staircase whose wooden boards sagged under their own weight. "This is home," she said simply, lifting her small chin with a defiance that both impressed and unsettled David. The climb to the second floor was a symphony of creaks and groans, every step a gamble. Emily pulled a string from her pocket, at the end of which dangled a bent key. She fitted it into the lock, tugged, and after a reluctant groan, the door swung open. The air that greeted them was heavy, damp, and tinged with the unmistakable scent of illness, stale sweat, mold, and the faint metallic trace of blood. Inside was a single-room apartment that might once have held warmth, but now resembled a storage space for forgotten lives. A dented refrigerator leaned crookedly in the corner, its hum irregular as though struggling for breath. A hot plate sat on a counter stained with ring marks. Wallpaper peeled in long strips near the window, which had been sealed with plastic wrap to keep out the draft. On the far side of the room, under a heap of mismatched blankets spread directly on the floor, lay Sarah Carter. Sarah was 35, though time and hardship had aged her beyond her years. Her hair, once chestnut, hung limp against her temples, damp with sweat. Her cheeks were hollow, lips tinged blue, and her breathing shallow, Every inhale a battle, every exhale a surrender. Even in her stillness, there was a trace of the beauty she had once carried: high cheekbones, a delicate jawline, a fragility that spoke of resilience worn thin. Life had marked her harshly, but not cruelly. Beneath the pallor lingered the softness of a woman who had once laughed easily, a sound now buried under years of exhaustion. Emily knelt at her mother's side, pulling the blanket higher. "She hasn't gotten up since this morning," she said, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "I left her a note, just in case." She reached beneath the pillow and retrieved a small folded paper, words scrawled in an uneven handwriting. "Mommy, don't be scared. I went to get dinner. I love you." David's throat tightened. He crouched beside Sarah, instinctively pressing 2 fingers against her wrist. The pulse was faint, barely there, and her chest rose with alarming effort. His business-honed mind calculated outcomes with cold clarity. Without immediate medical attention, she wouldn't survive. He rose swiftly, pulling his phone from his coat pocket. "She needs a doctor." Now his voice was steel. "I'm calling a private ambulance." Emily looked up, wide-eyed. "Will they let me come with her?" Her tone carried no fear for herself, only for the fragile figure beneath the blankets. David met her gaze and, for the first time in years, offered a promise without caveat. "You're not leaving her side." Not for a second. Within 20 minutes, the sound of tires screeched softly against the curb outside. 2 paramedics entered, a tall man named Greg Hastings, with sandy hair and a weathered face, the kind that bore decades of night shifts, and a younger woman, Lila Nguyen, with sharp dark eyes and the gentle voice of someone who had chosen this work because compassion fueled her. Together, they lifted Sarah with practiced care, securing her onto a stretcher. Emily clung to her mother's hand, her small knuckles whitening with effort. As they carried Sarah down the creaking staircase, Shadow began to bark, not a panicked sound, but sharp, commanding, insistent. His body trembled as he darted back and forth at the edge of the stairwell, his nose pressed to the air as though tracking every motion. The sound startled Greg. "Whose dog is this?" he muttered. "It can't come in the vehicle." Before David could respond, Emily cried out, "Please, he has to come. He's our Shadow. He protects us." Her voice cracked under the strain, her cheeks blotched with fear. Shadow, blind eyes hidden beneath the white bandana, lunged forward and pawed at the side of the stretcher, whining low as though begging permission. The driver outside frowned, already reaching to shut the ambulance doors. "We don't transport animals," he began, but David raised a hand, his tone carrying the authority of a man used to ending arguments. "Open the door. He's coming with us." There was a pause, then a reluctant nod. David climbed inside with Emily, who still held Sarah's hand. Shadow leapt awkwardly but determinedly onto the vehicle floor, his claws clicking against the metal before settling beside Emily. He lowered his head into her lap, pressing his muzzle against her small fingers. Though blind, his presence radiated certainty, as if declaring silently, "We'll get through this storm together." The ambulance roared to life, sirens slicing through the wet streets. David sat rigid, one hand gripping the railing, the other resting on Emily's shoulder. Across from him, Sarah lay motionless, her face pale against the sterile white of the sheets. Emily bent her head over Shadow, whispering into the dog's ear as though he could carry her words to her mother. "Don't be scared, Mommy. We're going someplace better." The city blurred past the rain-streaked windows, neon smearing into streaks of color. Inside the ambulance, 3 unlikely companions, an overworked CEO, a fragile child, and a blind guardian, rode toward a future none of them had chosen, yet all of them were bound to face together. The hospital became a world of its own, sealed off from the rhythm of Seattle's bustling streets. Days bled into nights, marked only by the muted hum of fluorescent lights and the steady chorus of beeping monitors. Rain came and went outside the tall glass windows, sometimes soft, sometimes violent. But within the pediatric wing, there was only the smell of antiseptic, the murmur of nurses exchanging charts, and the fragile cadence of hope trying to bloom. David Miller had traded his boardrooms and penthouses for molded plastic chairs and vending machine coffee. His trench coat hung wrinkled on the back of a chair, and the sharpness of his usual tailored presence had softened. Dark circles shaded his eyes, his brown hair no longer perfectly combed, but falling slightly over his forehead. Yet, despite his exhaustion, he stayed. He stayed beside Emily, who occupied a small cot in the family lounge, and he stayed beside Sarah, who lay motionless in a bed framed by wires and tubes, her thin chest rising and falling with the stubborn rhythm of survival. Dr. Anjali Patel, a woman in her late 40s with salt and pepper hair tied neatly in a bun, entered the room one morning with a chart balanced against her hip. Her sharp brown eyes spoke of intellect, honed through years of training, but her voice carried the softness of someone who had learned to deliver painful truths with compassion. "Mr. Miller, Emily," she began, glancing at both of them. "Your mother has advanced pulmonary disease, likely chronic infection left untreated for too long. We've stabilized her for now, but it's severe." She adjusted her glasses, scanning the notes before continuing. "We'll need intensive care, oxygen therapy, and time. It will not be easy, but she's fighting." Emily sat cross-legged on the chair, her sketch pad open in her lap. She nodded silently, her face unreadable, though her fingers pressed hard against the crayon she held. David reached out, hesitated, then rested a hand lightly on her shoulder. She leaned into it just slightly, almost unconsciously. Later that day, Emily revealed the page she had been working on. It was a drawing, rough but vivid, made with the crayons David had bought her. A hospital bed was sketched in the center, her mother lying in it. Beside the bed stood two figures, a small girl with pigtails clutching a stuffed rabbit, and a tall man in a gray coat with broad shoulders. Between them, a single line connected their hands to Sarah's. Emily looked up at David with a shy half-smile. "It's us," she said simply. For the first time, she had drawn her family not as two, but as three. David felt the air catch in his chest. The line of graphite on paper weighed heavier than any contract he had ever signed. Shadow, meanwhile, had woven himself into the fabric of the ward. Nurses who had initially frowned at the presence of a dog now bent down to scratch behind his ears, or place small bowls of water by Sarah's bed. His blindness was no obstacle. If anything, it heightened their admiration. Children from other rooms would sneak out to pat his thick black and tan fur, whispering secrets to the dog with the white bandana over his eyes. To everyone's surprise, the head nurse finally granted permission. Shadow could remain beneath Sarah's bed, stretched at her feet, so long as he remained calm. He did more than that. He became a fixture, the silent guardian who never left his post. One evening, David sat in the dim light of the room, his laptop unopened on the table. Emily had dozed off with her head on his arm, the crayons still scattered around her sketch pad. Shadow lay curled near Sarah's bed, breathing slow and steady. The night was quiet, too quiet, until suddenly Shadow's ears twitched. He rose, stiffened, and let out a sharp, guttural bark that broke through the silence. The sound jolted David upright. Sarah's chest was heaving irregularly, her breath shallow and strained, her lips paling. Within seconds, alarms began to shriek on the monitor, but Shadow had known before the machine. Nurses rushed in. "Doctor!" Patel close behind, barking orders with precise urgency. "She's in distress! Get me a crash kit!" Emily woke with a start, crying out for her mother, but David held her close, whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep. The flurry lasted minutes, though it felt like hours. 4 lines were adjusted, oxygen delivered, and slowly, painfully, Sarah's breathing steadied. The tension in the room eased, replaced by the sterile hush of relief. Dr. Patel placed a hand on David's shoulder. "If not for the dog," she said quietly, shaking her head. "He knew before we did." Emily slid off the chair, hugging Shadow fiercely, her cheek pressed into his thick fur. "You saved her," she whispered, tears streaking down her face. The dog tilted his head toward her, tail thumping once against the floor, as if in answer. Hours later, when the storm of fear had passed, Sarah stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy but aware. She turned her head slowly, wincing at the effort, and found David seated beside her, Emily asleep in his lap, and Shadow stretched faithfully at her feet. Her lips trembled, tears sliding silently down her hollow cheeks. She had expected to wake alone, as she had so many nights. Instead, she woke to the sight of her daughter, safe, guarded, and a man she barely knew keeping vigil. Her fingers inched weakly across the blanket until they brushed David's hand. Her whisper was barely audible, but it carried the weight of gratitude and surrender. "Thank you." David covered her fragile hand with his own, the corners of his eyes burning. In that sterile room, lit by machines and shadows, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't charity nor pity. It was recognition that fragile lives tethered together, even briefly, could create the smallest of miracles. And so, the nights continued. Each one a battle, each one a victory simply for surviving until morning. David read updates, Emily drew worlds on paper, and Shadow, blind but unwavering, became the heartbeat at Sarah's feet. Seattle's rain had finally broken into light. The evening sky stretched wide, painted in hues of amber and lavender, as if the city itself exhaled after weeks of storm. The sidewalks shimmered, damp but alive, and the park near the north end carried the fragrance of fresh grass and blooming dogwood trees. Against this softened backdrop, Sarah Carter walked for the first time without a nurse's steadying arm. Her steps were slow, but each one carried a quiet triumph. Sarah's recovery had been steady if fragile. Weeks of oxygen therapy and medication had filled her cheeks with a touch of color again. Her hair, still thin from illness, was pulled back with a simple clip, exposing a face marked by hardship, but no longer dimmed by it. She was lean, her frame delicate, yet her eyes glimmered with a resilience that had survived the abyss. Where once she had spoken in whispers, her voice now carried warmth, low and gentle, like someone relearning how to take up space in the world. David Miller was beside her, no longer the untouchable CEO, but a man whose trench coat had been replaced by rolled sleeves and a simple navy sweater. He had rearranged board meetings, ignored impatient investors, and allowed silence to fill the places once crowded with numbers. It startled him how natural this new life felt, how little he missed the skyline of glass. His hair, unkempt at the edges, caught the last streaks of daylight, and when Sarah's hand brushed against his as they strolled, he didn't retreat. He let it linger, then folded his fingers around hers. Earlier that week, he had helped them move. The old apartment, with its damp walls and broken window panes, was no longer a place for healing. Instead, he found a small but warm two-bedroom apartment near Green Lake Park. The building was modest, painted pale yellow, with a shared courtyard where children played in the evenings. The kitchen had a refrigerator that hummed with life instead of stuttering like a dying engine, and when Emily Carter ran through the rooms, her laughter bounced off the freshly painted walls. Emily, with her braids swinging and cheeks flushed, had claimed her room immediately, decorating it with drawings she had carried in a folder from the hospital. The first paper she taped proudly to the refrigerator was the sketch she had made in the hospital. 3 figures, herself, her mother, and David, linked together by their hands. This time, however, she added one more shape, Shadow, drawn as a tall, watchful dog with a fluttering white bandana. Shadow had become more than just a companion. He was now the heartbeat of their new home. At 8 years old, his muzzle was graying, but his posture was proud. Though blind, he navigated the apartment as if it had been designed for him, moving from Emily's bed to Sarah's chair with quiet certainty. The white bandana around his head caught the breeze whenever the windows were open, a flag of loyalty that never wavered. Nurses had once doubted him. Now, he was family. Emily fed him bits of toast at breakfast, Sarah patted his broad head when her strength faltered, and David often found himself talking to the dog in quiet moments, as though Shadow understood the weight of his unspoken fears. Neighbors soon noticed them. Mrs. Lawson, a widow in her 70s with snow-white curls and a fondness for floral dresses, introduced herself in the courtyard one afternoon. She carried a plate of cookies and smiled kindly at Emily, who shyly offered her one of her drawings in return. Mrs. Lawson chuckled, promising to pin it to her fridge. She had seen too many people come and go in this building, but something about this little family felt steady, like roots taking hold. In the evenings, they often walked together to the nearby park. Emily darted ahead, skipping along the stone path, her laughter bright against the dusk. Sarah followed slowly, leaning sometimes on David's arm, though each day she needed less support. They would sit on a bench overlooking the water, the surface reflecting the fire of the setting sun. It was here, beneath the painted sky, that Emily pulled another sketch from her small pad. This drawing was simpler but heavier with meaning. 3 hands, one large, one gentle, one small, linked together in the shape of a heart. Beside them, the silhouette of a dog stood tall, its head lifted as though sensing the horizon. The white bandana fluttered in the breeze, a banner of trust and belonging. Emily handed it to David with a grin that revealed the missing gap of a front tooth. "This one," she said, "is for all of us." David folded the paper carefully, as though it were a contract more binding than any merger he had ever signed. His throat tightened, but he smiled, slipping it into his jacket pocket, resting it over his chest. As the sun dipped lower, Sarah leaned against him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought, after all this, that I'd have more than survival." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. David squeezed her hand gently. "Neither did I." And in that silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the faint bark of shadow lying at their feet, they both knew. They were no longer fragments. They were a family. In the end, what happened to David, Sarah, Emily, and even Shadow was not only a story of survival, but a reminder of how love can appear when we least expect it. Sometimes the smallest miracles are not lightning in the sky, but a hand reaching out in the rain, a child's drawing on the fridge, or even a blind dog who refuses to leave. For those who believe, it is in these moments that God shows his presence, weaving broken lives together into something whole again. In our daily lives, we often rush past the quiet miracles waiting beside us. Maybe it is a neighbor who needs a smile, a child who needs patience, or a stranger who simply needs someone to notice. These are the threads of compassion that God uses to remind us that none of us are truly alone. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of faith, hope, and love. And if you believe that God still works through the most unexpected moments, write amen in the comments. May he bless you and your family today and always.